So let's just go through, a little more simple example, and that's just, and I hope that answers your question, of a tenant that's, wants to renegotiate the lease. So the first thing the landlord asks is, let's see your financial, situation. What's your, you can't pay the rent. You don't have revenues coming in. What's going on, which is like the total opposite of what normally happens, is today, if you're a very strong tenant with a good balance sheet and revenues and what have you, you can't renegotiate. It's very hard for you to renegotiate a lease. A lease tenant's just going to say, pay your rent. And in fact, when I was listening to the Empire State Realty Trust, they were saying, even the tenants that have the money aren't paying, but they know they can get that money. They can sue, and they have an opportunity to recover the money that those tenants aren't paying. There's a pot of money there. If you're a weak tenant, totally different story. You have a lot more leverage, because the problem with the landlord, as you can see, is now if he loses a tenant, replacing that tenant is going to be near impossible for months and months and months. So if you're in that range where you're not doing well, and you have absolutely a lot of leverage to talk to that landlord and renegotiate the lease to something more meaningful. So a lot of what's going on is really fact dependent on the tenant's financial strength. And the weaker the strength, the better off you are. It's very, I would never think I would ever say those words, because it's usually the complete opposite. The term, if you have a long term versus a short term, the shorter the term, the more leverage you have as a tenant. A lot of times tenants have termination rights in their lease, and they forgot about them. The management was changed in the last 7 years, 8 years, and nobody ever really read the lease and said, oh, by the way, we have a right to cancel in year 7, and let's exercise it. So I had the opposite situation where a nonprofit had a lease, and they had an option to buy the building, and they didn't realize that they wanted me to do a lease abstract. And I told them, you have this option to buy this valuable piece of property at, below market value. So knowing your lease is the critical. That's like, for a tenant, the first thing you do is you got to understand what your rights and obligations are, and that's all in the lease.